It's good to have a job there, right? People spend so much time there, she listens to overtired or over. When it's in the part of the I gotta look at my.
Have his email, but I don't know.
What's that?
I have an email address, but not a phone.
Yeah, I just emailed him, but I know what I could, that's.
Good morning, Bob.
Emily, do we have waiting?
I'm sorry, are you talking to me, Kevin?
Yes,
You don't even have to.
yeah, how many do we have waiting on Zoom?
I'll tell you in a second. We have 18, including myself.
Well, Bob Pillage is dressed for the part, maybe he could.
Oh, that's weather.
Yeah.
Match on the floor between your feet.
Brian is on Zoom.
Oh, is he here?
Brian is present.
Okay.
Oh, there he is. Got him.
Oh, terrific. Welcome, Brian. So
Good
I'm
morning.
going to light our flaming chalice here. There we go. All right. And so I'm going to begin with the reading, and then I will introduce our speaker, Brian Melendez. This is a quote from Black Elk, Haka Sapa, who was a holy man of the Oglala Lakota people and a cousin of Crazy Horse, actually fought with him in the Battle of Little Bighorn. He was also a survivor of the massacre at Wounded Knee. His wisdom is captured in a book organized and published in 1932 by Joseph Neihart, and in an ethnology by the academician Joseph Brown called The Sacred Pipe in 1947. In 1886, Black Elk visited New York, and this is what he said about it in the book Black Elk Speaks. I did not see anything in New York to help my people. I could see that the Wasichus, the white people, did not care for each other the way our people did before the nation's coop was broken. They would take everything from each other if they could, and so there were some who had more of everything than they could use. Crowds of people had nothing at all and were starving. This could not be better than the old ways of my people. They had forgotten that the earth was their mother. So we have this morning Brian Melendez to speak to us about Native American spirituality. Brian and I share the honor and distinction of writing for the Faith Forum in the Reno Gazette Journal on Sunday mornings, along with Guy Brown and Karen Foster. So Brian is here to share another forum with me, and that's our Sunday forum. He is an enrolled tribal citizen of the Reno Sparks Indian Colony. For the last 2 decades, he has worked as a grassroots organizer for the colony. He's a former legislator of the Tribal Council of the Reno Sparks Indian Colony, a Sundance chief, and perhaps he'll tell us what that is, and a spiritual leader for his tribe's summer ceremonies and other ritual dances. He's also a former federal operations officer for the Bureau of Indian Affairs. He is the founder and CEO of Tribal Minds, a Nevada native-led nonprofit. He holds a master's degree in justice management after a bachelor's in criminal justice, both from the University of Nevada, Reno. He's currently working on a novel and promises to finish it this summer. So we'll all be looking for that, Brian. And you have the platform here. Thank you for coming.
Awesome. Hama yoho dua sabi pijat pijat manato. Inaniana depina na mana makwara makoho. Inaniana depina ma makwara makoho. I'm honored to be here this morning. My name is Brian Melendez, Northern Southern Paiute Western Shoshone. I grew up on the Hungry Valley Indian Reservation just outside of Reno. I'm part of the Reno Sparks Indian Colony, which is centered in the middle of the city of Reno. So our community, our government is in the middle of the city, and Hungry Valley is our secondary community. It's the rural community up in the mountains. So we have one community right in the middle of the city, and then one that's probably about 13, 14 miles northeast as the crow flies from the city of Reno. And so we have two home communities. And so the one is super urban, and then the other is a little bit more rural. And so those two different communities have different things kind of happening in those spaces. We moved out to Hungry Valley. My mother got a house out there when I was 12. And so then we left the colony down in the city and moved out to the other reservation, which was pretty much life-changing for lots of people. And for us, historically, something in Nevada was really different. Because when we moved to Hungry Valley, that meant that community, that reservation, the things that were happening there were going to be established. So when you're thinking about Indian reservations across this nation, a lot of Indian policies and things that have occurred, these things have already been done. So when people were living on the reservations, some of these reservations are very old. And so when you go to these really old established spaces where people are going, sometimes there are already multi-generations of people who lived in those spaces. So when we got to that new place, there was a lot of things that weren't concrete yet. And so one was that when the people got there on this land, we were back in this area that the Hungry Valley was now located on was also part of our traditional homelands in a different sense. And so there was a story about that land. So when we got back to that land, there was already a story, a tribal story about it. And so then when we got there, we were figuring things out. And so when we had gotten to Hungry Valley, there was a lot of people who came into that place who some of them didn't know each other. And so there was a lot of tribal people from a lot of different places when they got there who had been living in the cities, who'd been kind of living all over the place. And when they get to this reservation, they're learning about each other for the first time in some way or another, especially the young people. So the young people were creating their own ecosystem with each other because they didn't know each other. Maybe the adults kind of knew each other, but we didn't know each other. And so when we get to this space, we're figuring out who we are going to be. And so the community that I come from is a very young community, which means that when you're living in an older community, the customs and the rituals and the way and the life ways that people have established and the things that people have agreed upon are already inborn in the ways in which the community will live as Indigenous people. But it was very different for us. So when we got to where we were, we didn't have we weren't predisposed to certain customs or traditions because the people weren't together, so they couldn't agree on things. For us, it was brand new. So when we get to this space, we were making them as we were going. So there was a lot of things that were being created as we were making our community. So you fast forward now, right? You fast forward to 2023 and you look at this community now, and you're looking at all of the little intricate details of this community, the way that the community thinks about resource, the way the community thinks about water, the way the community thinks about economic spaces, the way they're thinking about cultural, spiritual understandings of their ceremonies and their rituals. All of these things are being built as we're existing in them. So there's a draw from practices that are hereditary practices passed down through generation to generation, through family, that make their way into this community now. And all of these like practices, beliefs, rituals, however, show up into this one space, and they're kind of left to the hands of the children. And so the children, who are the young people, are now the moving force behind what gets to live and what doesn't get to live in the culture. And so the young people are the ones who are sustaining and growing and developing the language, the culture, the ceremony, the ritual, and all of these things, which is really, really different than what has happened in other communities. So what's happened in our community has changed us extremely in so many other ways, because if you're a young person and you grow up in a tribal community that's an older community, somebody has given you something. Like you walked into somebody else's footprint and you're really just kind of stepping into that existence. So for us, it wasn't like that. For us, it was, we were creating our existence as we were going in our community, in our culture, and our identities were being like piecemealed together by lots of things. And so what that's done for us now is that's made that when we look at our communities now, it also means that when we're looking at academics, economics, spirituality, community, the homeostasis of the culture, then we're looking at it with a real modern lens. And we're looking at it with a way that we're able to kind of hearken back to the past and look at like what our people have done, how we've lived, how we've, how the utilization of medicines, the utilization of songs and culture. But we're also looking really far forward, and we're looking at the utilization of everything else. How does this work? What are the governance structures look like? What are our economic development opportunities look like? How many businesses do we need to create? How many institutions do we need to build? And what does that capacity look like? And all of those things that I'm talking about are ingrained with that sense of spirituality. They're ingrained with that ideology. There's a real pragmatism to the culture, and that's what I see now. And so as an American Indian spirituality scholar, I write about a lot of these things, and I look at a lot of these things. And so like the passage that was read previously before I started speaking, which is the Black Elk sentiment of his observation of European Americans and their treatment of each other and their brethren, and how do they look at their ecosystems, and how do they look at resource, and how do they look at care? Is there care? Is there kindness? Is there greed? Is there animosity? Like, what does that look like in those community spaces? And I think that from a tribal lens where we come from, and how I've looked at these things in a lot of spaces and a lot of reservations across the country with a lot of indigenous people across the country, I would say the same thing. I would say that looking at things now, I'm better prepared at giving a summation of where I think these things have come from and where I think these things are going. And it's only because we're like in it all the time. And we're working in these things all the time, whether it's the customs or the ceremonies or the language or the rituals or the governance or the economic spaces. Like, we're working in these things so much in all kinds of countries, because we work with indigenous communities from Canada to North America to Central America. We're like working with all of these communities in these nations all across the board, that when you work with so many communities, you start to see a lot of similarities in the way that their culture has been impacted by lots of things, right? Whether it's, I guess I could say like the maybe the wide net of colonization, deforestation, you're dealing with ramifications of lots of things that impact the culture. But from where I'm able to live in my community and how we look at things, I would argue that our community and our reservation and the people within that space who are doing the ceremonies, who are maintaining the culture, who are maintaining the things, the essence of the people, those people are extremely progressive. And I think the progressiveness of the way that they're going at the ceremony, the way that they're walking into the ceremonial part or their identity, and the way that these things like cross layers of who they are in this space, in that space, how they exist and how they maneuver is really dynamic. And it's something that I don't normally see in other spaces. And that's me being extremely biased because I come from that community, but I'm only able to understand it because I've existed with lots of tribes and lots of communities and practiced with them in many, many spaces with different ceremonies. And so it's a really different subset of experiences. But the reason I wanted to share my community and what's going on in my community with you guys here is the fact that we are not very far away from each other. Like where I'm at right now, you know, I'm in Reno, and we're not far. So these cultures are not like where these reservation spaces are in relation to where you guys are broadcasting from. It's like we're all really close to each other. So one might not understand like how much shifting and change is happening in like these small communities all around you. And so it's kind of nice to know that, right? It's kind of nice to know that there are things that are happening in spaces that maybe we are not aware of. And so I'll give you a little bit of sense of history here. So Nevada is home to, and this number pops up. So there's kind of an internal like structural, I don't want to say argument, but it's kind of an internal thing that happens with the tribal nations here. So there's nations that are within nations in the state of Nevada, and there's tribes within tribes in the state of Nevada. So there's a lot of different structural things, but so this number is always shifting. So it's starting to shift now between 27, 28. And so there's the distinction between 27 or 28 tribes in Nevada. Anyways, I'm usually just saying 27 because I like the number. So that's what I've been saying forever. So that's kind of what I run with. The 27 federally recognized tribes in Nevada. However, Nevada is the 6th largest native populated state in the nation, which means that in the United States, Nevada is number 6 when it comes to ranking of the population base of indigenous people here, which is really significant. So in Northern Nevada, where we are, Northern Nevada is home to the Paiute, the Northern Paiute, the Western Shoshone, and the Washoe people. Of those 3 groups, the Paiute tribes and bands and groups are by far the largest, followed by the Shoshone, and then the Washoe is the smallest of the groups. And so, and then if you go to if you start going south in the southern part of the state, you'll hit, Southern Paiutes down that side. And so all of these tribes kind of stay within their spaces. They live within their areas geographically, and then their cultures and their language kind of exist within. So there's really something interesting about the tribes in Nevada and the Great Basin cultures. And one of them is that every single community that you will go into, the reservations, the colonies, every single community has their own culture, their own language, their own ritual. Their way of life is very different. So from one space to another, it's very, very different. And so if you go to one community, the way that their ceremonies and the way that their rituals work are very different than the next. And so as a culture, we've become accustomed to the variation, which is very different than, let's say, like large organized religion bases, maybe like Christianity, where you're saying, okay, here's this book, here are the tenets, here's how we live, here's the roadmap. And as long as you stay within the framework, we can agree on some things. But when it comes to the rituals of the tribes of the Great Basin, there's always so much variation that the people have a great understanding that our rituals and cultures are extremely diverse and that they're different. And so there's beauty in the difference. And so when we're looking at the differences, we're saying, oh, there's a lot of difference here. That's amazing. Look at the difference in this beauty of the way they do things. That's an amazing sentiment. And so that's happening quite a bit. And so when you go to one place, there's a lot of kind of community protocol and cultural protocol and how we kind of enter those spaces. But I think there's a lot of beauty in that. And I think that for those things is what helps our communities here to be really impactful. So I know when there was a little curiosity about like the Sundance. We were talking about the Sundance, like, what is that? What is this? So I want to give a little backstory on that because I think it's really interesting for all of you guys historically. And so historically, the indigenous tribes of this continent have always been in exchange with each other, whether that be spiritual exchange, ritual exchange, resource exchange. There's always been a great sense of exchange that has always occurred here. And so our languages are indicative, they're indicative of these shifts. So like my language that I speak is part of a larger classification of language called Uto-Aztecan. So Uto-Aztecan ranges all the way from like the northern part of Oregon through California, all the way down to the Central America, south of Honduras, and then east as far as like Oklahoma and the Southern Plains. And so that language family is linked with all of these other languages, all the way up from like Northern Paiute, all the way down to Huichol, Nahuatl, Purepecha into Mexico, and all the way east into like Comanche, Kiowa, Shoshone, and then looping all the way back around. So you're talking about a lot of tribes in these like geographical spaces that share linguistic similarities because they've exchanged and speak with each other. So back in the late 1800s, here in the Great Basin, there was a man who lived, and he was a Paiute man, and he was living on the Walker River Paiute Reservation at the time. And his name was Jack Wilson, but his Indian name was Wovoka. So Wovoka for us was a person who had a vision, had a dream. And so Wovoka had a dream, and he was dreaming about the land and was dreaming about these different times and scenarios that were going to come. And so Wovoka would have these dreams about these rituals. And so as Wovoka was having his dreams and he was putting it all together, what he called this dance was Na'anaga. So Na'anaga in our language, literal translation means like the father's dance, the way in which the father showed us how to dance. And so as he's doing this dance, the tribes and the people in the community were listening to his story and listening to his vision, and they like joined in on the vision. And so that created a movement. And so during this time, there was a lot of upheaval across the nation. There was a lot of fighting between the federal government. The armies were killing Indians. They were, taking land, and they were just wiping out tribes across the country. And so as this is happening, soon as the non-native people, the European Americans, saw these natives gathering on these reservations, they started to give it a name. And so the name that they gave this dance later was the ghost dance. Because there wasn't, we were dealing with language barriers, right? So the Paiute people are trying to explain to the non-native people what is kind of occurring. And so they needed a really catchy name for the process. So then in turn, it becomes like, oh, there's this like revival of ancient spirits, and they're getting ready to go to fight, people. And here we are. And then the ghost dance shows up. So eventually, as they're kind of putting media attention on this organization and the way that things are happening in the Great Basin here in Nevada, all these other tribes from the country start making their way to Nevada. Tribes from the Pacific Coast, tribes that were coming down from Washington. There were tribes that were coming from, the Great Plains. They were coming from all directions to get to Nevada. So when these tribes get to Nevada, they start having these exchanges. And so in our cultural customary way, we're still having these exchanges. And so ceremonies are getting traded for ceremonies, is kind of like how like you would trade seeds for seeds. So people are trading ritual for ritual. So at this time, the occupation that was occurring in South Dakota was happening with the Lakota people as they were putting on forts. So Red Cloud, Sitting Bull, these people were over here on that side in South Dakota figuring it out. So Sitting Bull sent his delegation. He sent a delegation of, I think, the first time he sent about 10 people. So he sent 10 warriors from South Dakota to Walker River Reservation here in Nevada to meet with Wovoka. So he sends 10 people. So they travel from South Dakota to Nevada by horseback. They get here, they spend a couple weeks here on the reservations, learning about the ceremony, figuring things out, and then they go back to South Dakota, and then they tell Sitting Bull, hey, look, this is what we saw, this is what we felt, this is how it went, this is what's going on. Sitting Bull then in turn says, okay, you're going to go back there and you're going to make a trade. And we're going to trade the Sundance for the ghost dance. So in South Dakota and in those parts, they have a variation of their Sundance. And so the Sundance ritual that gets traded, I'll talk about in a minute, but so Sitting Bull sends his delegation back. They come back to Nevada. This time they come back with 3 sacred pipes of their people. And so when they bring those sacred pipes to their people, they bring it back to the reservation to Nevada. They give it to Wovoka and say, look, these 3 pipes are for your people. And with it comes the lessons and the teaching of the ghost dance. And in return, we're going to take the ghost dance and we're going to go back home. So they take the ghost dance, they leave the Sundance. So our tribes here have always had our variations of sun rituals, sun worship, sun dance. We're in the desert. I mean, I don't know how you're going to get away from the sun. So that's what it looks like. So we have many, many ways that we pray and worship in the sun. And so in our language, we have 3 different constructs of this. So in the language, you have what they call Daguan. So Daguan means to like stand thirsty, which is part of like a prayer. It's part of like a fasting prayer in the sun. Then there's Tabakwan, which Tabakwan means to like stand like patient in the sun, to like to wait for like a lesson, right? So there's Daguan, there's Tabakwan, and then there's a third one that we don't really use so much, but it's useful in the construct that these ceremonies were changing, right? So when we're standing out in the sun and we're talking about these things and we're talking about how the ceremony changed. So our way of ritual in the sun shifted and changed in the late 1800s with the introduction of the way that we took on the other ritual. So when we took on the other ritual, it shifted our, I guess, kind of our, inherent rituals of here to now include this structure. And so once we took their ceremony, we integrated it kind of across the board. So those 3 pipes that Sitting Bull had given our people went in 3 different directions. So one went up north, so it went kind of northeast. One of them went kind of down south, and one of those pipes stayed on the reservation. And so wherever those pipes were what they called altars. And so the altar of the knowledge. And so when we're talking about like this article came with knowledge, it came with instructions, it came with a purpose. So this bit of information gets handed down. So as the pipes are moving around, so is the knowledge and the information. So eventually these things are getting shifted because they're landing in the hands of people. So as they're landing in the hands of people, they're growing and they're changing as they're evolving because the story changes, like the game of telephone, right? So it's kind of like, oh, look, this thing is changing a lot. So eventually we're talking about like, where did these elements go? What happened here? So somewhere in 1989, 1990, one of these pipes ended up through some osmosis ends up being housed on the Hungry Valley Indian Reservation, where we grew up. And so this is where one of those 3rd pipes landed. So these pipes have been traveling for decades through reservations and all these things. So when our community is being created, the pipe shows up. And so this pipe shows up in our community at the same time we're trying to figure out who we're going to be. So all the while we're like building our identity around this construct of these things that were the stories of our people, but also the practical applications of how we were supposed to live. So these things have a real impact because for us, they weren't just like items that just sat on a shelf. These were things that we were using, things that we're, that are such an inborn part of our identity. So the Sundance is different than what is now the ghost dance. So the ghost dance ceremony and ritual now belongs to the Lakota people because of the transition and the exchange. And that version of the Sundance now belongs to the Paiute people because of the exchange. And now the belonging of the ritual to these large groups somewhat means that I or other people, like, I don't own it. It's just the people's things now. And so it's part of the identity. And so at some point, people will either do things with it or they won't do things with it. And so these things are still very much in active use. So when you're talking about, or if you've ever heard of like the Wounded Knee massacre that occurred in South Dakota, when the cavalry, 7th Cavalry went down and killed hundreds and massacred hundreds of women and children in the snow in the Wounded Knee, area, those people were doing the ghost dance and they were praying. That's what they were doing in their prayer. They were ghost dancing in the ravine, and the cavalry came on top and just gunned them down and killed them all. And so these ceremonies, so the ceremony that they were doing in South Dakota at the time that they were massacred was a ceremony and ritual that came from the Great Basin. And the ceremonies that we're doing here came from the South. And so there are great cultural exchanges like this still happening today. We're exchanging with Anishinaabe people, the Anishinaabe people in the woodlands. Now we're going down into Central America, working with the Lenca tribes in Honduras, culturally exchanging rituals with them. And so these exchanges aren't just ancient old things. These are modern things that have modern application because they're happening all the time. And they're really significant. And they reaffirm the past because it's something we've always done, but they create a new baseline for us because it's something modern that we can maintain in our minds, something we can record and study. And so there's a lot of data that comes from these things as well, if a person is looking at it from a quantitative, qualitative basis. So we're looking at these things in lots of different ways. So going back to the Sundance. So the Sundance ceremony is one of our most beautiful ceremonies. And there are lots of variations to it. Just like I had mentioned before, in our reservations, our communities have so many different changes. There's so many different variations. Now, this ceremony has a lot of variations. There are foundational parts that are the way they are, but everything else is kind of flexible. So the Sundance is basically for us here. So there are lots of different types of Sundances. So the different tribes have their different variations. So let's say like the Lakota, the Cheyenne, the Crow, the Hidatsa, the Arikara, the Shoshone, the Ute, the Arapaho, the Paiute. Like there's lots of tribes that have different variations. And all these variations also mean that the variation is geographical. It's what the land will provide for the ceremony. It's also cultural, which means like what the language of the people and of the culture include in that. So I'll give an example. So I'm looking at lots of beautiful people sitting in chairs right now. You're looking at me and I'm looking at you, right? And so let's say that wherever you come from on the globe, wherever your heritage is, wherever your people come from, wherever you are attached to the land, comes a memory and an existence. If we were to give you these ceremonies and say, okay, here is the kind of the framework for this thing. Now you went back to your home and you started integrating the foods you like or the food that grows in your garden. Maybe it's carrots, maybe it's radishes, and you start talking and maybe your language is whatever your language is. And like all of a sudden this thing evolves. So if you came back 100 years later and you guys like did this, you'd come back and this, you might be able to see remnants of it, but there would be a lot of changes also. And so that's what it looks like across the country in these rituals, lots of changes, but similarities nonetheless. So the Sundance for us here in the Great Basin is one of our more sacred rituals that the people are doing. And so these are happening on reservations all across the state, and they're happening on undisclosed times. They're often closed to other people. People never know that they're happening, except for the people that are internal. They're hardly ever advertised. These are never things that we monetize. These are never things that are kind of public. These are really beautiful things that are withheld from people who wouldn't, I don't know, maybe appreciate it. So there's something in there in the back that there's kind of a firewall culturally inside of that, where people that make their way to the ritual are making their way to the ritual because somebody entrusted that they would appreciate it, they would love it, they would care for it, and they would not hurt the people. Like they wouldn't, like they would take care of it. Because the Sundances are so like, they're beautiful, but they're also kind of fragile, right? So they're beautiful and they're kind of fragile. So these things require people to come in like a good headspace, like come in a good mind. And so when the Sundance season happens, which is a huge thing for us here in Nevada. So Sundance season is in the summer when it's the hottest. So when it's the hottest time of the desert, right? You're talking like, we're all here. We know what hot Nevada, warm, arid, dry weather feels like super hot. So when you're super hot in the desert, that's when we're dancing. And so we're out in the mountains and the deserts away from people. And in the center, there's almost always a tree, right? Whether they import a tree or they have a live tree, there's a tree in the middle. And then there's a structure. There's structures of dancing. There's songs that go along with the ritual. And then there's a series of, there's dancing and movement that's happening. So the Sundances last 4 days and 4 nights. So for 4 days and 4 nights, there are these indigenous people in the deserts of Nevada fasting, no food, no water for 4 days in the sun. And so for 4 days, dancing in the sun, no food or water. And so this is a really hard thing to do. And this is like a physically hard thing to do. But the thing that's beautiful about it is that the ceremony itself strips apart like the doubt and the fear of what we think we can or can't do. And all the while the people are praying and they're trying to find resolve. They're trying to make sense of these things. And when they come out of it, it's like they're brand new some way. Like there's something that's happening in that process. And so there's a lot of growth that's kind of occurring. So if you're looking at like a Judeo-Christian calendar, right? We're looking at New Year's on the 1st, we're looking at Christmas, we're looking at these things. But on the indigenous calendar for us, Sundance is our New Year's. So that ceremony for us, whenever it is happening, is our New Year's. So in our reservation, our New Year's this year will be July 12th this year. Other reservations, it'll be like August 2nd. So that's their New Year's. So they're starting their cultural calendar on that first day. The first day of the dance is their first day of like that process. And they're moving through their new year like built in the ceremony. So their whole year is revolved around preparation for this 4 days of dancing in the sun. So it's like the whole system is wrapped around these 4 days. And it's hard, so hard, but beautiful. So there's a lot of things that are happening there. There's the fasting, there's the praying, there's a lot of elements, like there's a lot of things. I'll just tell you this. There are things in the Sundance that are so, I'm trying to think of a word, but the word might just be hard about it, that it would be difficult for people to see it and understand without doing it. It's kind of like one of those things, like you do it and you see it, you're like, okay, I understand now why you guys live like this. Like, I understand like why this is happening. So there's a lot of components to it. And maybe one day we'll talk about it some more and, you know, you'll learn some things about it. But I think that is what we do. So in our reservation, our communities, we have our Sundance in our community. And I'm the guy within our community structures who leads the ceremonies for our communities. So I lead the Sundance in our communities, and then I help other people within those communities. There's a question, is that do we still perform the ghost dance? We do. So those ceremonies are still occurring, they're still happening, and they're happening. So this right here is like the circle, right? So let's say this is like the people, like the tribe. So let's say this is all inside of the circle is all the tribe. Maybe there's like 3,000 people in this tribe. This smaller circle, maybe there's like out of the 3,000, maybe there's like 300 who are actually doing the ceremonies and the language and everything else, right? So maybe out of the 300 that are doing ceremonies and everything else, maybe 100 are the sun dancers, or the actual people who are those people who have crossed that threshold and are living that life, because it's a way of life. So like if you were thinking about like churches, right, or like religion, and you would say like, well, what is a sun dancer and what is like religion? So what would that equate to? So think about a sun dancer as a person. It's almost like somebody who's like a monk or a priest, or somebody who's committed themselves to a way of life. So somebody who transitions to a way of life, and that way of life is a life of servitude. So these sun dancers choose a life of servitude for the greater good of the communities. And so there are even smaller pockets of people who are doing these other dances, who are doing these ghost dances, who are doing these sun dances, who are doing all these things. And some of these things are so small that they're hidden within the people. So even the people at large would never see them, because the people at large, even though they are indigenous people in their communities, maybe they're not in a good headspace. Maybe they're not doing things right. So there's things like that, you know. I think there's a lot of things that, and so I'll give you a little backstory, and I apologize, I'm burning up my time talking about all this other stuff, but I want to leave some time for questions, but I'm going to answer this really quick. So I run a Native nonprofit. So the Native nonprofit that we run here in the state of Nevada, we do a lot of statewide work. And so with the statewide work means that we are a proverbial bridge organization. Our organization exists so we can connect all of these groups with all of these other groups. So in our organization, it's the only one that exists like this. I don't know of any other organization that does what we do nationally or anywhere. But we work so we can help bring people in and bring people out. And so we're trying to make these beautiful networks for people to exist with each other. So it's a lot of work, but it does help, and it is, you know, beneficial. So like for us in our communities, a lot of times we'll bring people out. Like I'll just say, hey, look, you want to come to the reservation, come to the community, you want to meet some people, you want to see some things, here we are. Because I've learned that sometimes the best form of advocacy is people actually understanding what they're seeing. And so sometimes it's easier to just take a person in there, work with us, be with us, eat with us, pray with us, figure it out. Then you'll have an understanding of where this is going. So I think there's a lot of things like that. I'm going to put my email in the chat for you guys. And we have a lot of volunteer opportunities. We have a lot of things that we're doing. We're always doing work all over the city, all over the state. And so at any particular time, if you guys want to jump in or like grab some coffee or talk about anything, I'm always open. I'm so open all the time to answer more of these questions. And then again, like I said, maybe make it out to the community, or maybe make it out to your community. You know, I'd like to come out and hang out with you guys. So I think that there's something there too, right? I think my view, so I worked for the Bureau of Indian Affairs for several years. I came in as a self-determination officer, and then I was a tribal operations officer, and then eventually a acting superintendent of the Western and Eastern Nevada agencies. And so my take on the BIA is that the Bureau of Indian Affairs has a lot of work to do, and they have a lot of work internally that needs to be done. But I think if you're looking at systems, if I'm just talking about systems, I would say that the system is running the way that it was intended to run, which was dragging its feet and not really thinking too much. And so I think in Nevada, I think Nevada is a great place to like look at the Bureau of Indian Affairs. So if I was to say, should the Bureau of Indian Affairs be abolished in a state like California or Arizona, I would say, I don't know how useful it is there. But in the state of Nevada, I would say that, and I'm trying to be as objective as I possibly can, that the Bureau of Indian Affairs absolutely has, is kind of a lifeline to a lot of tribes in Nevada, because there's more than half the tribes in Nevada are extremely impoverished. So in Nevada, you're dealing with tribes that are in urban settings, remote settings, and rural settings. So the tribes that are super remote and have no resources almost always depend heavily on the Bureau. So if the Bureau wasn't there, then some of these tribes would really, really struggle, because some of the other tribes aren't really helping the other tribes as well. So I think that that's kind of like a catch-22. And when I'm talking, and then so going back to our community, as far as like conservation efforts and things of that nature, I think our community, it does a pretty good job. Again, we're in the desert. Again, we're dealing with impacts of awareness from the leadership and what they're seeing and how they think about sustainability. So our organization does a lot of trainings. We train governments on tribal governance. So we do a lot of work in those spaces to help build kind of awareness around what's happening in, external to the reservation or indigenous thoughts. So we're doing a lot of work like that. So we do a lot of things in those spaces to help the tribes. And I think that there's a lot of discussion that's pretty forward thinking happening in those spaces. But I want to take some questions. I want to be able to, I'll answer anything. So whatever you throw at me, I want to be able to answer. And thank you for listening. I know I never stopped. So I was like, oh.
The idea that like, oh yeah, this is like, I'm sorry, but me and Ellie jumped onto a time machine and went back to 1500 on the land. We're not dancing for the backstrap and the heritage. We're dancing for a reason. We were dancing.
Here. I got it. Not running.
Okay. Can you hear everybody else now? And if you go to Tribal Minds on the web, there's a beautiful video of ceremonies, some of which I think Brian's just alluded to and so forth. Am I right about that, Brian?
Yeah, there's a lot of stuff out there. I mean, I suppose a person could look online and find a lot of things these days. But if you want to go to our website, I'll put that in the chat as well. You can find a lot of information about the work and the communities that we work with, and the
I think Lloyd had a question as well.
Yeah, I actually have 4. In the language issue, they describe this language family from Oregon all the way down to Central America. Are they mutually comprehensible languages? Can you speak to each other?
Can you repeat that? I got part of it about the language.
Yeah, I was wondering whether these languages from Oregon down to Honduras can talk to each other. Are they comprehensible to each other?
Some of them are.
And across the country, are there language translation facilities available so you can speak to people in New Hampshire, for example?
Yeah, so we usually travel when we're traveling like that with the different spaces, because we're traveling with first language speakers. They have their first language speakers, so that's usually kind of like there's kind of a lot of soundboarding kind of happening there, and then figuring out. Now, obviously, there's going to be a lot of variation, but there's certain things that are really specific, or some things that are I don't know how to explain it, but there's some things that are. And I don't want to put more importance or less importance on words or things, but it feels like some things that are really big maintain the bigness, and some things that weren't, they got changed. Like, for example, like sun, water, wind, things like that. Like there were things that the people, I don't know, there were things that the people said, no, this is like an absolute for us. This thing doesn't really change very much. So sometimes those things maintained. Sometimes we can understand each other if people are talking, but you could almost always hear the rhythm or the sound of our language in their language. which is pretty awesome.
Are there other questions in the chat there, Emily?
There are some. Hold on. Here's one. Oh shoot. It says, what are 3 volunteer activities most needed in Reno?
I think, in the next couple months, I think a lot of the volunteer activities we've been doing, so the last few months, we've been trying to put a lot of effort into putting things back out into mutual aid. So we've been working with other organizations who are helping to kind of feed people. They're working with people in those spaces to take care of, houseless populations. We're looking at our community spaces. I think we're working on garden projects. We're trying to figure out those areas where we can start building and planting so we can get food back out to the people. So those are some areas. We have a couple events happening through the summer. We have some community powwow events that we're doing where the people can come out and help us set up, help feed people, things of that nature. So some of these things are like that. We have ritual, like our ceremonies, our summer ceremonies and stuff like that. So we'll always kind of have stuff that needs to be done there. So these volunteer activities or things are like helping us get the grounds ready, helping us get wood ready, helping us do things for these times. So I think we'll have a lot more of that. And I think as the summer gets going, we'll be doing more work like that. Because the spring, summer, fall are our big busy times in our communities.
Yep.
So that's where kind of a lot of that is. So it's more like hands-on, get dirty kind of work.
Thank you. There's this question was repeated, Brian. It's how can white people be allies with the indigenous people?
I think that's a great question. It seems like it's a question that I'm kind of answering lots of times. The question is, what does that look like? And I think
Yes.
it's like anything else. If you can imagine, if you try to imagine this. You grow up on a remote reservation somewhere in Nevada, and it's 150 miles to a grocery store, gas station, emergency room, what have you. And the only people you ever see in your community look like you, talk like you, think like you, and that's just what it is. So you're structurally removed from people. Now, if that person has to go out into like a metro area like Las Vegas or Reno and interact with people, they're going to struggle. And because they do. And so because things are so different than where they come from. And so they're removed from lots of things. So when we're talking about the indigenous base, we're talking about what does it look like to communicate with people from 3 different sectors of indigeneity of the mind, right? When you're helping urban Indians who live in urban settings, it's a whole lot easier to have those engagements than it is, say, rural, remote tribes that are living in remote places are the hardest to connect with sometimes because of the living experiences. So those 3 sectors also come with different understandings or lifestyles. So how do we do that? How do we go to those places and how do we learn about people? It's understanding that things are scary for them sometimes, just like it's scary for non-native people to go into native places too. And so I think it comes with a lot of education. And I think there's a tremendous amount of education that can happen. Now, granted, somebody would say, I guess if you kind of look at maybe a platform like race relations, somebody would say, well, in a race relation kind of atmosphere, it is not my job as a BIPOC person to have to explain or educate to you. However, as my community and from where I'm where we're at, we don't have time for that. So what we have time for is who wants to jump in the ring, who wants to get dirty, who wants to learn things, who wants to be of service, who wants to get their hands moving in the dirt and the soil and with people. Because I feel like sometimes that's the best way to learn about things. So people who really want to learn about things and who are passionate about learning about things can learn about things. And I think that to help people also means to understand people And so I think understanding these indigenous communities and where they come from and how they live and how they're like making sense of their reality is probably the best thing that a person can do to be of service. Because I guess in that instance, it's really about learning and being and like having a heart for that learning. Because if the Nana people come in and try to learn what we're doing, that also means that we have a responsibility too on our end to try to learn about what you're doing. And so we as indigenous people are kinesthetic learners. And so the way that we're learning and the way that we're going about this learning is where we are giving to each other. So when somebody says, well, how do you help indigenous people? I would say, well, how much capacity do you have in your heart to learn and give to another person? Because if you have that in your heart to live and give to another person, then that other person is going to give back to you, because it's in our culture to want to like have a mutual exchange. Like we don't take things, we don't take from people, we don't take from the land, we don't just do that. So what, I guess, how much room does a person have in their time and heart for that kind of existence? Because we're not in the business of making friends, we're making relatives.
I think we have time for one more question, and Guy, I have a question.
Awesome.
I was curious with the Sundance. How do the people, are the people selected, or how do they select themselves into the group that actually does the Sundance?
So a lot of times the families will choose the people. So the families will choose, if nobody wants to represent the family, then somebody will choose somebody within the family who has at least 3 characteristics. And the characteristics that they're looking for the most are, is somebody kind? Are they considerate? And are they brave? Are they courageous, right? Is somebody doing things because they're ego, or are they doing things because they care? Are they beautiful people? So that's kind of what they're looking at. So the question is, are there any books you would recommend us to learn about indigenous people? This book.
Rights of Indians and Tribes.
Yes. I've trained countless tribal governments all over the country. I do tribal governance. I'm a former operations officer. I've worked with lots of tribes all across the country. And this book is the one I always tell the governments, you need to read this. You need to read this book and you need to study it. And you'll have an understanding of what that looks like. Because that book is a logistical book, right? It's a logistical book on what has happened historically and why our government structures and community structures look the way they look. And so that is really important. And then the other books that I'm going to recommend to you, I'm writing in the chat. Now, these books I'm giving you, these books I'm recommending, these are not like entry-level books. These are like change your brain kind of books. And these might throw you off a little bit because they're hard. It's not just like it's a hard read, but these are not normally books that people delve into unless they really want to learn something. So I'm just shooting them over because I feel like you guys are on a path. So I'm just going to recommend them over. So the books I'm sending over.
Right.
These are by a famous writer, indigenous scholar, and law professor named Vine Deloria. Vine Deloria he's my idol. And I just think he's so brilliant. I think that what he's done is kind of the future of what indigenous governance, economics, spirituality, the direction it was going. I think that he knew. And so he just wrote it. I think he was a scribe for something much greater.
Well, Brian, thank you very much for teaching us, helping us to learn, starting us perhaps on a learning pathway. And we very much appreciate your being here and hope that you will come hang out with us
Yeah,
some Sunday. We would really, really love that and love learning more. And thank you for the books. I think we're going to be delving into them. So,
awesome. Awesome.
very good. So I'm blowing out our flame here, but the flame you've lit today will continue to burn in our hearts. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I appreciate you. Thank you guys so much. I love you. Be well. If you need me, just reach out. We'll connect.
Very good. And so the next Sunday forum actually will be some character named Kevin Murphy talking about minority religions of the Middle East. You'll learn about the Yazidis and the Zoroastrians and the Samaritans and the Mandeans and a couple of others that you may or may not have heard of. So stay tuned. And Brian, thank you again.
Awesome. We'll see you guys later. Bonito out.